Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the IBM Champions Chat live stream. My name is Libby Ingracia, and I'm the program director for the IBM Champions. The IBM Champions program brings together experts and advocates together to form a community of sorts. The IBM Champions are 600 folks around the world who are customers and business partners of IBM, who are the folks who have the most enthusiasm and passion for the products and technologies and have just a great authentic voice around what can be done with those products and technologies. Our IBM Champions chat live streams come to you twice a month approximately, where we bring those champions in conversation with IBMers and others in the community. Today, I would like to welcome you to our chat on open source and how that connects with and works with IBM systems, meaning IBM Z, IBM Power, and IBM Storage. Let me introduce first our my co-host and producer, Luke Shantz. Hi, Luke.
Hello, Libby.
How are you today?
I am doing well. I'm in the midst of a snowstorm, so it's an interesting day.
But yet when we look at you, it's all black. So we don't see the whiteout of the snowstorm. We just see the reverse. Are you like the reverse snowstorm?
I have to think of like a black hole on the internet here. Yes.
So one of my favorite parts of our Champions Chat live streams, Luke, is to hear what it is that you're hoping to get out of our conversation with these awesome champions today.
Well, so, as you know, and probably many of our listeners do, open source is such a big part of what we do at IBM and just at the enterprise world in general. But what I love about it, and what I'm curious to hear about today, is how much it's really about the people, right? And it's open source, there's all these business justifications, there's all of these things about it, right? But what I love is it allows individuals to really sort of shine through larger industries and, company agendas, and it allows them to contribute and really make a name for themselves. And so I'm curious to hear what our team has to say. And, as always, we do have a podcast, and we talk about a lot of open source on there. We've got actually a data science podcast. We have an IBM Z DevOps podcast. We have got an app modernization series, and, open source throughout. So looking forward to hearing what our guests have to say.
Well, and of course, as you often do, you gave me such a nice transition. These individuals there's so much individuals. So let's meet them and we'll get into conversation. So let's start with Javier, our IBMer, who is joining us today.
Hi, guys.
Hi, welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Would you maybe just take 1 minute and introduce yourself to our audience, Javier?
Sure. Great to be here. Thanks for the invite. I run the open source program office or program for the IBM Z organization. We've been in open source for a long time, more than 20 years on the IBM Z organization, but joined a kind of a unique role where I'm about advocacy, I'm about promoting open source, I'm about engaging with communities, engaging with foundations, a lot of work with all those upstream contributors that we want them to, continue to work or invite them to the platform. My background is on actually not on mainframes. My background is on cloud native software, always in software. We're going to have time to talk more about that, but my background has always been on, or at least over the last 10, 15 years, on open source, cloud offerings, SaaS offerings, containers, microservices, all that good stuff.
So you're getting to learn a lot of good things about the mainframe since you've taken on this role, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. And it's not a lot different. You get a lot more horsepower for sure.
Exactly.
But it's not a lot different. I mean, it's all a lot of Linux, right? And Linux is the same Linux on a BlackBerry PI or on a mainframe.
I love it. All right, Luke, let's meet our conversationalists, our awesome IBM champions. So today we have couple of folks from Power, Liam and Lionel, and Alex from the mainframe and Z side. Alex, do you want to get us started? Introduce yourself, and then we'll go across and get everybody introduced.
Sure. Thank you, Libby. And it's great to be here. Thank you for asking me to join. My name is Alex Kim. I'm working for Vicom Infinity, IBM's premier and gold partner for Z, Linux One. I'm the solutions architect. I've been in this industry about 20 years. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. And Liam.
Yeah. Hey, what's up? So yeah, thanks for having me as well. Haven't really iterated that enough. Appreciate it big time. So my name is Liam, obviously, and my primary focus is Node.js, basically on IBM I. And outside of that, excuse me, containerization, running Node apps, connecting to the IBM I DB2 for I, primarily helping customers take, what their existing applications, homegrown ERPs, and basically making the use of Node.js and React on the front end, and how we can bring that together and make everybody and make it all cool, again, for IBM I basically. And, in terms of open source, mostly contributing to toolkits and database drivers for DB2 for I. So I've just started writing a native database driver for IBM I because there really isn't one for Node. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on right now. But that's pretty much me. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Lionel.
Hi, thanks, Libby. So I'm the CTO and co-founder at InnoBoost. It's a startup and IBM business partner in Switzerland. And we craft turnkey solutions for complex customer needs, combining state-of-the-art technologies from our ecosystem with open source and also homemade software. While doing this, we help partner and like ISV port and optimize their solution on Power. I've been a champion for Power since 4 years, and I'm focusing on Linux on Power, mainly within the HPC and AI space. I'm also the chair. I've been chairing the machine learning workgroup inside the Open Power Foundation since some time now, and we'll probably speak a little bit later of what it is. As far as I remember, my first contact with open source was in 1998, when I first played with a Red Hat Linux 5.1 CD. It was a bit different than today. And I've been playing with open source since then, and I use open source every day. I'm mostly a consumer of open source, but I'm also trying to contribute to project by reporting bugs, helping with documentation, donating also to some projects, and so on.
The important stuff.
It is. Yeah, it's funny, I don't often toot my own tech horn because I've sort of been out of the deep technical hands-on for quite a while. But around that 1997, 1998 time is when I first got involved in open source, because I wrote an article on how to run Domino on Linux. So built a Linux box, ran Domino on it, wrote the how-to. So I'm patting myself on the back for being, there at the beginning. Anyway.
I love the Domino.
So I think one of the things we should start with, just so that our audience is clear, is a quick intro about, I think I've mentioned it, but Javier, what the IBM systems covers was one of the things that you wanted to make sure that we kind of got out there. And I think from hearing, audience from hearing who are kind of panelists, conversationalists you've gotten that idea, right? But so systems is IBM Z, obviously, is IBM Power, and then IBM Storage. And I think, we don't have a storage representative here. I think later on, Alex, you've got at least one storage story to tell us.
Right.
Awesome. So in your introduction, you guys talked a little bit about your participation in open source communities. I guess what I'd like to hear to start us off is, open source projects you're involved in with IBM systems. Can you, maybe draw some connections for our audience between the open source communities and the IBM systems products and technologies? Who wants to start? Okay, go ahead, Lionel. Get us started.
I think the most obvious one is OpenShift, since it's highly promoted now by IBM and so on. But it's one of the technologies that is quite used. It's getting quite used, and we try to use it for our own projects. We started some projects with it. And,
I think we are. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Oh, no, it's okay. Go ahead.
I think we're at a point where all software offerings have open source, right? Every piece of code now has libraries that are open source, and there are studies there that says something between 50 to 99% of the code includes open source libraries, right? Or includes open source already. So starting from that baseline, pretty much all software has open source now. Now, in terms of commercial offerings, in this case, IBM software for IBM systems, so for IBM Z, Linux One, Power, or storage, all that software, the commercial offerings are actually based on open source software, with a few exceptions there. But obviously, let's not forget that when I talk about open source, people reminds me that IBM, it's also the #1 company in patents, so closed source, which is the opposite. But we are very much engaged in open source, right? And all the commercial offerings have their based on other open source. And Lionel was talking about OpenShift. I actually worked at Red Hat as well, now part of IBM. And every single offering from Red Hat, it's based on another open source project, right? And people sometimes get confused there. I like to call them open source projects versus commercial products. So products and projects, and sometimes are identical, right? So in the case of OpenShift,
it's CryIO,
yeah. Well, it used to call Origin, and now it's OKD. The open source version is pretty much the same, right? And with Linux, same thing, very much the same. One is the open source project, the other one is the product, the commercial supported product. Yeah.
Right. I think I have a great memory of seeing IBM system jumping into open source, I would say, world or lake in 1999. I think that was before I got a job offer from IBM. I started IBM in 2001 as a mainframe hardware engineer, but I was in still school in New York City, and I was walking around. I think it was around this time. It was winter, right? And Times Square and 32nd Street by the Macy's, and people who are not in US, that's like a biggest city and busiest time of the year in the Christmas time, and the center of Manhattan. So I see this signs everywhere, and even in the road with penguins on it. It was amazing. The huge tower with the penguin logo on it, and it was a sign of IBM saying, they had a commercial. I can't remember exactly what they were saying, but that they committed like $1 billion to commit to the open source community with the Linux. And a couple of years ago, when IBM and also my company, Vicom Infinity and Linux Foundation had WebEx session inviting, I think, as like a second in command line after Linux Torvalds in Linux Foundation. We had a top chat like this, and he said IBM actually is very strong contributor to upstream in Linux kernel, and they realized that a lot of times the very strong recommendation architecture coming from a lot of IBM developers for Linux kernel, especially in the security area, and they were amazed by those because they know that those kernel is not just coming from individuals, but from industry contributors like IBM. They have a 50 years of history understanding the infrastructure that they are applying back to the open source community, and that was very amazing comment from someone in Linux open source community who's in charge.
I can tell you more about that story. I recently wrote a blog post actually about the 20 years of Linux on IBM Z. And just really quick, I mean, obviously I don't want to take all the time here, but basically 1999, so more than 20 years now, Java back then, actually I already heard a couple of comments about the 90s, and all right, so we're the same age. Back in the mid 90s, right, Java was when it was becoming really, really popular. And they said, well, we should have Java in the mainframe, but if we're going to go with Java in the mainframe, well, let's put it on Linux. And Linux started just a few years before. I believe it was 1991 with Linus Torvalds, the first package of the Linux kernel. So a group of engineers in Germany, Boblitkem, the research center is still there, and most of those engineers are still with IBM. They actually went and installed Linux on Z, right? Back then on Linux on Z. That, well, actually it was not Z, the name back then. It was 360, 370 back then. And they had it running. And just a year later, 2000, that's what Alex was just mentioning, that there was a big splash, big announcement of a $1 billion investment on Linux across the board, across all platforms. Right, so that included Power, that included back then AS400. Some of you might remember the AS400, and with that money, they went and paid for all those commercials. And there's another famous commercial, 2003, a Super Bowl commercial. I don't know if you might remember this little kid that is sitting there, and then there comes all these famous people to kind of teach the kid. And then at the end it says Linux. It's actually the Linux Foundation shows that video all the time. It's there. You'll find it in YouTube for sure. And that's how it started. And then they went all over on open source, right? So this team actually in Germany, well, we have engineers all over the world, but this team in Germany, especially that team, they continue to contribute to the Linux kernel. They continue to contribute to kernel subsystems, so a bit outside the kernel. Linus Torvalds is still the maintainer of the Linux kernel. And we actually have at IBM not only contributors, but some of the maintainers in the different subsystems around. So you're saying, well, that's great. You're improving, enhancing Linux. But the main thing here is, especially for Power and IBM Z, is to do optimizations on Linux to take advantage of the features of the hardware, right? So optimizations in performance, optimizations in cryptography, optimizations in compression, all those great features that we have on the platforms. Well, how about improving Linux, which, by the way, it's open source, so everyone benefits, to take advantage of those features. So that's why we still do it, and we're going to continue to keep improving Linux. And of course, Linux being a great example of a successful open source project that keeps growing, keeps innovating.
It's interesting. I want to come back to the projects connecting with systems in a minute, but one of the things that what Javier was saying made me think about is the question about the value of open source. It's that connection between project and product is really an interesting one when you think about companies who want to make money. And so I'd love to hear our champions' input on the value of open source and why it's so important. And then we'll kind of come back around to the connections with systems. Thoughts? Alex, you look like you have an opinion.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you. So in my opinion, I think the choices given to enterprise users are one of the greatest benefit. So I think before open source was so popular, and even before licenses are created for software and intellectual properties, there were a group of people actually started sharing the code and have distributed to, I think we can talk about it later more, but having individual developers and even organizations who develop software and give back to community as a choice, and then they take input in open format, I think a great great benefit to everyone who consume the software. And also by doing that, there are other benefits like security get checked by individuals or users of the community and verified, and that's another benefit. So there are many benefits to the enterprise users as well as the individual users.
Interesting. Liam or Lionel, do you have any different perspective? Lionel?
Well, I think one of the most useful for enterprise, even if it's not the most taken care of, it's security. Because with open source comes, it's supposed to come security, because you don't have to trust the code provider for security of the functions you are using. You can look it yourself. And if you are not an expert in security, you can have someone, an expert of security, having a look at the code and telling you, okay, yes, it's safe. While if with a closed source software, you cannot. You just have to trust the person who has provided to you. So
that's really interesting.
It's important. Maybe with the communities, it gives a link to the Open Power Foundation. if you let me speak about it now, because with the Open Power Foundation, so IBM open sourced the ISA of the power processor, but it also open sourced the firmware of the system, and so now you can get a fully open source solution done from the processor to the software stack, where you have full access to what you have. And I think it's what of the great value of open source. That was my 2 cents.
Liam, you had a thought to add on to that, I think.
Yeah, so it's not just security in open source, it's also, the idea of being locked in. So for example, let's say you are paying for a product that is closed source and they are, currently actively maintaining it. And then all of a sudden, and you don't have access to how it was made or how to continue extending it. That's one of my favorite things about open source is that, I can look at something, I can add something to it, or I can maintain it, pull requests, that's one of my favorite things. Second, security, but the first one is that I can keep looking after it if I need to.
That's a great point. I think I have been there. There are so many great programs written for, let's say, Windows 95, long time ago. And I even have those programs running in the emulator mode or backward compatibility mode. But what if there's no more support is given for that software? All the knowledge, all the practice, and even the knowledge in the software will be gone. And I think as a IT community, I think it's a waste. Having open source for those type of programs and application will last almost forever, right? As long as there's people who are using it and interested in maintaining it, I think it's a great benefit.
They are. If I can start with some controversy here, with open source, we also have our issues, right? Sometimes there are forks, and people that depend on some open source, then they are in trouble, right? But you always have the possibility to go and invest on that, right? Have your engineers, your developers going and continue that work, or keep influencing your open source project. Especially some of the most successful open source projects out there. That's why they become part of foundations, because they want someone that kind of handles and look at all the influence from all these different companies, of all these open source contributors, and kind of becomes the middleman there, and I say, well, look, we're going to go in this direction, or as a team, we're going to decide on going this other direction, and that's a great thing about the foundations. But obviously, I totally agree with Liam and Alex that it's a huge advantage over closed source. There's no question about that. But just for people to be aware, sometimes if you depend too much on one thing, you can get in trouble if things change.
Oh yeah, of course.
And
so I guess that's the benefit. Oh, I'm sorry, Luke, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, just to chime in there about this topic, I think that's that's the call to like, don't just consume, don't just go there, take what you need from that community. It's about being involved, contributing back, at least showing your face, participating, so that you have a seat at that table.
Exactly.
Definitely, yes.
Which is kind of exactly where I was about to go. You know, IBM has not only an investment, you know, sort of from the top down, but also encourages investment from, you know, all IBMers in the open source communities. And there's, you know, guidelines for how to do that and where it can be used and where it can't. I guess it could be a barrier to entry, perhaps, if you're in an organization that doesn't already have that investment. We've talked about the values. What's the other side? What's the barrier to entry, or, you know, as Javier points out, sort of a concern that you need to just really be aware of as you invest in open source? Liam, do you want to start us off this time?
Yeah, I think something that this is just this past week, is, you know, especially with involvement, is that, let's say you're using something like a package that's open source, and all of a sudden your requirements change and that package no longer does what you need. For me, that's a perfect excuse to get involved, because now we want to keep using this package, but we need it to, you know, we need it to make it work in a certain way that, you know, works for us. And I've just done that this week. So, you know, working with people, and we need something to change in this package, and I've given all the instructions here. Go and make a fork, go and make the change to how it works. And that's, in my opinion, is a great excuse. Any excuse is good, but that's my favorite one, personally. I don't know if that answered your question, but nonetheless.
Regarding,
but in fact, you replied, because one of the drawbacks is the opportunity. The drawback is it's a community. So if you start working with a project and the community diverts from what you need or what you want, this is the downside, because then you're relying on it and it's not doing what you want anymore. But the opportunity is that you have access to the source. So you just go by a freelancer and adapt the code or contribute yourself and go ahead.
One of the barriers I experienced myself, and I see from other coworkers or contributors, was that if you are a software engineer, you don't want to be in a legal battle, right? And the open source is, I would say, not downside, but there's some caution that we all have to practice and be, you know, careful, is the legal aspect of open source, right? And it's been great since, you know, Apache and the MIT and, you know, EPL license was developed. But before that was a little bit of, you know, haze, right? Because you want to deliver the software and solution, but at the same time, there are some legal aspects of it. And now is a great time, even if you're not open source software developer, there are many ways to join and contribute, which is those type of areas. If you are like professional in those areas, or even project management and writing technical documents, I see all different type of professionals join open source community, and I'm part of our for example, Linux Foundation Open Mainframe project, contributing and actively engaged and help each other. I think that's the way I think that can help people joining the open source community and get rid of the barriers and help each other. I see that was a great moment that I realized myself too.
It's so interesting. I have two ways I want to go in this conversation, just from what you guys have just said. On the one hand, I feel like you kind of opened the door, Alex, to the conversation around licensing issues and how to, what are the steps and how do you choose the right license as you work with open source, and then where does open governance fall into that? You guys have mentioned foundations a little bit, and I know that that's kind of the core of open governance. What do you all think about that? How do you work with that idea?
Well, I can comment on that. I actually been also writing about that, and my previous job was on a product that will scan open source software to identify the licenses for all those libraries that you use on your code. There's a security aspect, and then there's the licensing aspect. So for anyone that wants to open source their code, right? So let me start. There's different answers, right? One for anyone that has code out there, has a few scripts or some code there, and they're interested on open sourcing that. It's a bit more, just a little bit more than just putting it out there in a public repo. Right? Recommendation is obviously good practice to have a README file and explain what it is, and have a license file. It's just a file, and you can use any of the standard licenses, or basically copy paste the text and onto your license file. Apache and MIT licenses are the ones that basically give access to everything, full access, you can do whatever you want with that code. You make it available to anyone. And then there are a bunch of other, maybe another 100 types of licenses. Actually, the beauty about open source is that anyone can create their own license. You can write your own text with your own restrictions and attributions and whatever you want to do that. By the way, Facebook got in trouble for doing that, actually, because it was getting a bit restrictive on their licenses. There are some funny, it doesn't take you long to search and see some funny name license, which they basically say, do whatever you want to do with, in different choice of words. And so you have to have your license file, got your README file. If you want to also include instructions of your rules of engagement or for contributions, how you're going to set the contributions on your code, and there you go. You make it public, and you have an open source project there. By the way, if you are using software from a public repo that do not have a license file, that means that it's not open source. That means that the owner of that code at any time can go back to you, especially if you're successful, and say, I want money for that for that piece of code. So very important to see that if you're using code from public repos that have that license file. And again, then you can go and research in terms of all the different types, like GPL have some restrictions and so on. So that's from kind of going and creating from perspective. From commercial or from enterprise point of view, especially if you're creating commercial software, very, very important to go and making sure that you know every single license that you're using on every single library. And legal teams go and have to review that, and you can even assign the risk or the type of risk that you're taking depending on the licenses that you're using. So very, very important topic, actually.
Well, and it's interesting. I'd like to, I think, connect that back to systems as a whole. And, are there some specific connections to what you all are doing with the various projects and systems that you work on that connect to that?
I'm a regular contributor. And so anytime you contribute to an IBM repository, you basically sign off to say that it isn't yours anymore. It's just life. For me personally, any new repositories is always GPL. I personally am okay with not making money in open source projects, and I would also like nobody else to make any money. So if you want to contribute, work together. That's the way it is, and I'm okay with that personally. And that's where the product side of things comes in. That's a whole different story. So it's just from
IBM Z perspective, there is actually a huge open source community called Open Mainframe Project, and it's another big open source community under Linux Foundation, and it's been 5 years, a little over 5 years since the Open Mainframe Project launched it. And there are thousands of developers contributing, and of course, thousands of users and consumers out there, and it's great example of how IBM systems are being part of the open source community. And there are programs like, I think the biggest program I can mention is Zoe, that open source running on traditional ZOS, which is great program that if you are ever want to develop and participate open source for mainframe, this is a great place to start. Of course, there are Linux side of the open source and open mainframe project, including the internships. And this year, I had a privilege to have a student from Nigeria to work with me on a mentorship program, develop something called Zebra. It was a really fun project to teach the students to learn about traditional ZOS and how read the system logs from ZOS and then make it as a JSON formatted data to connect to any other open source software that consumes JSON data. It was an amazing experience. And after the mentorship is over, we proposed to be an incubator program and it got accepted. So it's so exciting journey to have someone who never had an experience on mainframe and coming on board and then develop open source project under this community and get support. And now it's an incubator. It was a great journey. And I think anyone who is interested in developing open source, and especially large systems like IBM Z, I would recommend to go to Open Mainframe project and check it out.
I love. Oh, go ahead.
Just to add to that, speaking about both Power and IBM Z, I mentioned earlier that Linux is the same Linux everywhere, right? But we are talking about different processor architectures. What it means really is that you have to build or compile, depending on the programming language, your code on the corresponding platform. So on Power or on Z. So we've been inviting, part of my job is really to invite the community, to open source community, to go and build their open source software in these two platforms. And all they really need to do, for the most part, all they need to do is just to build it, run it, compile it again, test it again. When you find differences is when there's more low-level coding, more low-level like memory allocation and things like that. In the case of IBM Z, without going into the details, but it uses the big endian memory allocation as opposed to little endian. So you have to switch the most significant byte or the least significant byte. And it's a small adjustment on the code. It's not that big, but that's only for low-level kind of memory allocation. For the most part, you just have to build it, code it. And we make available the platform. So people say, well, I can't just buy a Power system, or I can just buy a Linux one, an IBM Z, and put it in my living room, right? Well,
Can't?
Well, there are plenty of options out there. There are plenty of options for trials. Actually, there's the cloud version of it. You can just use it. And we make available, especially for open source project, we make available resources for those open source projects because we are more than happy to invite everyone to bring keep porting their software to our platforms.
Awesome.
If I can just take here, so for example, there are two things. One, we just have to be aware a bit because sometimes it's not just about compiling. Now, if you compile, it will work, but it doesn't mean it will always be efficient. There are so many codes out there that have been optimized by default, let's say, for not to say in the x86 platform, that it will not always work as efficiently as it should on Power or on Z. And so sometimes you still need to make some tweaks and but moving to Power or Z is a good opportunity for software developers because it will surely help fight and find some bugs, which is again a great opportunity of the open source world. Is if you have access to a new platform, you can test and you will find new bugs. And you have the link just below for example, for projects using CI/CD on Travis. now IBM is sponsoring Power and Z resources for open source communities to build their project there. There are also, like this second link, other options that are available. And if today you are a maintainer of or a coder to an open source project, I invite you to use those links, because it's really something that you can use, and you have, let's say, no more excuses not to support those architecture. And so they can be integrated quite easily now into your pipelines.
So having different architecture comes in, different side. I think oftentimes people think that, oh, it's not the same as my laptop, but there are so many great advantages, hardware features like compression and encryption that you can take advantage of on the built-in hardware, and you can have a taste of those. I think it was in the link before on those open source, open free service that you can sign up for and test it out. I think it's a great opportunity for anybody who's enthusiastic about taking advantage of hardware acceleration, and I think it's good to check it out places like that.
It's a great good invitation to all the communities, all open source, all developers to go and use on our platforms. Let me give you a little brief preview on some of the things that I know communities, especially on IBMers, are working on for the future. Right, talking about optimization. So I said that there've been optimizations on Linux for a long time. Lionel just mentioned, yes, optimizing will make it even better, right? So I know, for example, there are optimizations on Java. They are a lot of optimizations on COBOL. Someone was mentioning COBOL. Absolutely. There are optimizations on Go, right? That makes it work even faster on, I'm talking about Z for a moment, but I'm sure there is also for Power. And then just to give you a little preview of some of the work that has been going on right now, it's optimizations on open source for a number of open source projects on data science and AI. So things like Onyx, Kubeflow, actually Kubernetes. I know they are. There's work going on that will optimize for the platform. So it's going to make it. They're going to make it run even better, even faster, even more optimal, better for some of the I/O, especially transactional and I/O type of applications. So a lot of good stuff coming on open source.
And also, speaking of the advantages, IBM Research actually just announced a few months ago something called Homophobic Encryption. It was a breakthrough research that they announced, because not only you can encrypt in transit outside of the server or outside of the hardware or on storage at rest, but now you can actually encrypt within the process itself, so that you can process the encrypted data sets when you're doing the ALU, arithmetic, computations and such. And you can check it out, the link down there, that you can actually download the libraries and you can develop yourself and test it out with your workstation, and also deploy it into one server, that community server you can have an access for free.
Just hard to say that name. And homomorphic encryption.
Homomorphic encryption.
Yeah,
By the way, it's a long. IBM research has been working on it since at least 10 years, but now they do the FSA toolkit, and it worked great on Power also.
Yay!
The key here is that you need to have the performance to be able to decrypt where it's in use and get the information and whatever the usage is, and then maintain it encrypted. So for that, you need a lot of horsepower, a lot of processing power, and now it's available. Now it's doable, which is great. Yeah.
So we have about 15 minutes left in our live stream, and I have a couple questions that I want to ask and a couple of questions from our audience. I'm going to start with the audience questions, and then I might come back to the ones that I want to ask, but I want to make sure our audience gets their questions answered. One is really a very specific mainframe question for Alex and Javier. Does taking COBOL as a career now a good choice for a new graduate? And I know that there are a lot of programs for new to Z, and we've got a COBOL live stream on Fridays, I think, Luke, for learning about that. So what do you all think?
So I can go first, and maybe Javier can, add too. So people in probably U.S. realize that in this year of pandemic, there are some news about COBOL, having some hurdle to overcome. But indeed, it was more about other side of the systems that had an issue, not actually a mainframe or Z or COBOL resources. But having COBOL being part of this attention was a great opportunity to people realize that there are so many programs running with COBOL applications and moving this world. You probably don't know that whenever you swipe the card, credit card at the gas station, it's actually going through some COBOL application in the back end all the time. And there are 500, I think, top 500 companies in the world using mainframe today. Probably all of them have COBOL application. So it's a significant amount of application using COBOL and rely on it. And I would say go for it. Great opportunity to learn COBOL, and especially for new grads, because you understand the modern language, you understand the modern computer architecture, and you understand how to work with open source. And when you acquire those knowledge about how COBOL works, it's not that hard. Like Libby said, there are COBOL Fridays, webcasts, and also there are Open Mainframe Project COBOL group that actually actively engaging, educating, and having communities involved. And now you have a power on both traditional language that serve the many other companies. At the same time, you have a new skills that you have learned from school or practice in the modern language. Now you have a really great power to exercise and then get benefit of it if you're looking for a job.
Yeah, my advice will be, learn as much as you can, as many things as you will find opportunities either in COBOL or Python or whatever. So learn as much as you can, and the opportunities are going to come to you. And it's hard to plan your career, by the way.
It's very hard.
Any minute.
They take so many twists and turns, don't they? So then I also, and I've got some follow-ups that I might come back to on that, but I do, let me just say to our audience, this is a great time to drop your questions in YouTube, in Twitch, in Facebook, and we'll do our best to get those answered for you. This one I think is specifically for Liam. The audience member says Java is the new COBOL. Liam, if I have an IBM I application, would you put the open source stuff on I or on a Linux partition on the side?
It depends.
I knew that was going to be your answer.
It depends.
Do you want to expand on that at all, my friend?
Sure. It depends on a number of things. So it depends on what language you're using, what your current environment looks like, if you've got the space to run a separate environment, or if you want to do it in the cloud is also fine. And Java is the new COBOL, but so is PHP. So it's 2020, so I can say that now. But it depends. Like, for example, if I was writing a PHP app, I'd probably run it on the system. Mostly because it's more of a pain in the backside to connect to DB2 off the platform using a database driver. It's more of a pain in the ass. But if I was using Node or Python, for example, ODBC works fantastically in those environments. So you kind of have that flexibility where you can run it anywhere. That's the primary. It depends. I mean, that's That's the best answer I can give you with those little caveat there, I suppose.
No, it's a very good answer, but I think that even telling them how you would start to make the decision makes sense. So I'm going to ask one of my questions. We had a really good session on DevOps a couple of weeks ago, and we really talked about tooling. Well, we talked a lot about attitude, but you can bring that up, I suppose, because that definitely is pertinent when we talk about open source. I think there's a certain attitude that goes along with that, but we also talked about tooling. So what do you use to automate? So I know, Liam, you build toolkits and contribute to toolkits, but let's talk about what do you use to automate? What tooling do you use are you using open source tooling? Are you using, tell me what's going on there.
So this is another it depends situation. So if we're on a private cloud, usually most of the time it's Jenkins because it's the easiest to get running. On IBM I, on pretty much any Linux system, whether it's AIX or Linux on Power, Jenkins is generally the easy one to do. If it's something like a toolkit or an open source application, right now something I'm totally into is GitHub Actions because it works fantastic. I mean, it's just all over SSH, so works great on IBM I, works great on AIX, works great anywhere. So those are my two kind of go-tos right now. Jenkins is primarily open source, GitHub Actions is not, but both for the open source communities, both very good tool sets. There's also Bamboo, but the free edition is not great, which is that's an Atlassian product, but it's good, but it's not free. So
awesome. Alex, Javier, Lionel, do you have anything to add there?
I recently actually did a bit of a research because we had to prioritize what else we were going to invest as a IBM into the community and what other open source tools were there, and obviously the commercial counterparts. I think obviously Jenkins, GitHub Actions, they're very popular. Travis CI is very popular for open source. There's a recent change, by the way, there on their pricing that got some criticism from the communities. There are some actually up and coming CI and CD tools that run on Kubernetes, and they seem to be gaining traction now that people are moving into containers and with an orchestration with Kubernetes. So there are a number of products there. Actually, Jenkins had Jenkins X that it's on Kubernetes that complements existing CI/CD tooling. Tektron is another one, which I know we are in the process of making it available for Power and Z. We have the commercials, obviously CI, Travis CI, Circle CI, the other one, and actually GitLab is the other one that is getting a lot of traction, especially for people that are already using GitLab for the repos. They are using the CI component, they are using the security components there to go and scan their code. And then you have the traditional or the cloud offerings, right? So you get AWS, I believe it's called pipelines, or Azure pipelines, and you got the similar offering for Google Cloud, and IBM Cloud is offering Tektron with I believe Jenkins.
I'd like to second GitLab on-prem. We have a RPG and Cobalt customer who's using GitLab on-prem to deploy Cobalt. So
cool.
There you go. And Lionel, you had something to.
Yeah, I'm also seconding on GitLab. So I've been playing recently with it. So GitLab runner on Power. It's not officially supported, but there is some university in Germany who is building, and I'm trying to build a public-facing GitLab interface for projects to be able to build on our machine, which has GPUs and so on, so through GitLab. And the advantage of GitLab is you have both. You can, as Liam said, you can have it on-prem or in the cloud, and you work the same way. So you can branch together, and so it's very, very interesting.
So for all of those people doing hybrid where they've got some both ways, that makes it consistent for them. Got it. All right, so I've got one more question that I'm going to drop, and then I'm going to give everyone an opportunity to say one last word. We got about 5 more minutes or so. I wanted to go back to something that we've kind of touched on over and over again, and that's the idea of community. Open source, obviously, is all about community, and working together and collaborating and building upon the work of others. And as I think maybe Javier, Alex said very early in our conversation, that idea of sharing code and helping fix problems, and that's not new. That's not new to the open source community. That's user groups and communities everywhere for across products and open source and offerings and technologies. But I think what I'd like to hear from you all is what communities should our listeners be joining, be connecting to, for both the open source side and the systems side, and what intersections there should they be connecting?
Well, I mean, the most obvious is the IBM developer website, and from there you have open source, which is now at his home at ibm.com/open source. So it's even easier. I think it's the best for open source project and open source minded people. It's probably the best way to start. But also, if you need support as a developer, there are also many. There are the usual suspects, like even on Stack Overflow, you have tags for PowerPC and people who are replying to issues there.
And what about organizations like Common? I mean, how, if you're in the Power community already, is that a place where you're going to find open source support, or should you really just be looking at the open source communities or the others that you all have mentioned?
So Common is
no, why now? Go ahead. No, you should go.
Let's say Common is not from a history point of view is all about sharing, but it was more about AIX and IBMI, and mostly IBMI. But now, at least here in Switzerland, they have made the switch to also embrace Linux and speak about open source technologies and so on. So, and this year it's interesting because this year with the pandemic, they had to switch to a more webinar form of interaction, and they made some great webinars about open source technologies and how they can be used with IBM systems and other products.
Right.
Liam, you want to share your input, and then we'll get the mainframe side?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to, I only do Power and IBMI and Node. So there's a hashtag. It's, hashtag IBMI OSS. You can pretty much find that on GitHub, Twitter. That's like the best way to get involved, because anybody who's doing open source on IBMI, that's the hashtag they're using for everything. So
that means that when our listeners have questions following this, if they tweet to us or use that tag, then they're going to find what they need potentially.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that ask a lot of database questions on that hashtag using open source tools, and I usually would see it. I'm a regular browser of that tag, so big recommend on that.
Awesome, super, thank you, Liam. And Alex, what do you think?
Yes, thank you. So I mentioned Share. Share was the organization that started sharing this code. People brought tapes, literally physical tapes, to give up their code they developed even before the license term was developed, right? And then they still have those meetings. Now it's virtual twice a year, and there will be a Share in March next year. And also Open Mainframe Project, I would recommend to go there. They're about, they have a Slack channel. They have about 6,000 people in the Slack channel communicating about open source. And you can check out this website for landscape. What other projects under this open mainframe project is contributing and intersect with any other like a cloud native software, and our own open mainframe open source projects are there. It's so amazing to check it out.
Yeah, the other thing is most of the large open source projects, they have now a Slack channel, so I recommend to join there. Foundations, Linux Foundation, and all the other Apache Foundation and Eclipse Foundation. Most of the foundations also are using now Slack, so I recommend to join those channels. And then for just joining the IBM Z and Linux One community, we have multiple groups. I regularly get the daily emails with multiple questions there, and it's getting actually. I can see a lot more activity now, at least more than 6 months ago, which is great. Great to see more people engaged.
And also the storage side, we really didn't talk about it, but there are many other open source projects going on, and IBM storage support open source too. For example, the container storage open standard, they are supporting it, and OpenShift and OpenStack. And in one of the projects that we did on the summertime with Open Mainframe project was to create an Ansible playbook for IBM storage, DSAK and flash systems. So you can check it out on more in those websites that we referred to.
That's awesome. Well, my friends, my colleagues, I have enjoyed this conversation very much. We are at the bottom of the hour, so I will start to wrap us up here. If any of you have any last words, now is the time. Before we close, I want to remind folks that you can find the IBM Champions as a whole. You can find us on Twitter at IBM Champions. I think Luke just showed that. You can also find us at the IBM community, ibm.biz/champions. And if you want to connect with Liam and Lionel and Alex or Javier, you can do that through me, through those if you need to, or through the other links that they've shared. And if you have, continuing questions, use the hashtags that you've heard today, use the Twitter that we've mentioned, etc. So with that, my friends, if you've got anything else to share, let me know.
Just thanks for the invite.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it was great. Awesome.
Yeah.
Have a safe holidays, everybody. Thank you.
Yep. Happy holidays, everybody. Thanks for being here.